It was several years ago when I first heard rumours about historical cases of missing children in Belfast. As a documentary filmmaker who grew up in Northern Ireland, I was intrigued to find out more. At first, I thought the rumours might be apocryphal stories. After all, every community fosters its own half-truths and urban myths. But it soon became clear that these weren't tall tales. These children really did exist, and they vanished without a trace.
Thomas Spence, who was 11, and 13-year-old John Rogers disappeared in November
John Rogers in
1974,
waiting for a school bus on the Falls Road.
Thomas and John did not arrive at school that morning.
Somewhere, some person knows something that could help in our investigations.
My initial research didn't uncover much, certainly not what I would have expected in the case of two missing children. But I did discover a fellow traveller. Someone else was also searching for answers. Local criminologist and author Robert Giles.
This is one of the darkest, most troubling crimes I've ever looked at. Two young boys vanishing into thin air.
But we'd soon come to realise that this horror story wasn't just two missing children. There were others.
I can't think of any other cases where boys disappeared around the same time, in the same area. I've never come across anything quite like that before.
And the truth behind these disappearances may be more sinister than either of us had first imagined.
It is easy to look back with hindsight now and say what should or could or really must have been done.
The lack of evidence, the lack of investigation, what the hell went on here?
There was evidence of a network of paedophiles.
Was there a deliberate cover-up? The investigations seem to have been either scant or deliberately limited.
The files were all destroyed. The question arises, who authorised the destruction of those files?
The real issue at stake are those young lives which were blighted because of organised buggery as a result of the activities of a dirty trick department.
This kind of thing happened, and people just don't understand that it happened, but it did.
November 1974. Two boys, described as having learning difficulties, were standing on this stretch of road waiting to get a bus to school. On the morning of the 26th of November 1974, 11-year-old Thomas Spence from Rockdale Street goes missing. On the same morning, we have the disappearance of 13-year-old John Rogers, Thomas's best friend. Thomas Spence lived over there at Rockdale Street. John Rogers lived down there at Rodney Drive. And the two boys were last seen together. The last sighting of them was at a bus stop on the Falls Road. This is one of the busiest roads in all of Belfast, and it's where the mystery begins.
It would have taken Thomas 30 seconds to get from his front door to the bus stop. It would have taken John a couple of minutes at the most. We know they made it there. There was a confirmed sighting from a neighbour, but after that, nothing. What happened to Thomas and John after that last sighting has been a mystery for nearly half a century.
In all probability, whilst the two boys are still classified as missing, we have to presume that they're now dead. I believe the boys are dead. And I believe there's a high probability that they were murdered.
If Robert's theory is correct, and the boys have been murdered, then why have their bodies not been found and their killer, or killers, never caught? These are questions with no easy answers, except to say that Northern Ireland was a very different place back in 1974.
Belfast rocked by yet another night of rioting. Bomb blast rocks Old Park area. Paint shop burned out in Derry. Falls riots, another man dies. Horror and tragedy in Belfast.
Northern Ireland has long been a disputed corner of the world. In 1969, there was an explosion of violence. On one side, you had a Catholic nationalist minority who, by and large, wanted a united Ireland. On the other, a Protestant unionist majority broadly wanted to remain part of the UK. On both sides, paramilitary organisations were engaged in a brutal sectarian conflict that would last 30 years.
The Troubles unleashed some awful, deep-seated hatreds within the society itself that had been lying dormant for decades. You've got these people who are out there. They're out there in the shadows. They're waiting to kill innocent people. You've got people on the streets. You've got Catholics, Protestants. You've got Republicans. You've got extreme loyalists. You've got the Provisional IRA. You've got the evangelical crowd who are playing with loyalism. You've got the British Army in there. You've got the police force, the RUC. There's so many elements, and they're all colliding in one form or another. And they're all colliding in a conflict which is going to become a long war. There was so much happening that you didn't have time to be reflective, to put things into context. What you were doing, this was straight reporting. We call it chasing ambulances. The paramilitaries were determining what was, in many ways, what was going to make the news.
I'm looking through the Belfast Telegraph for November 1974. This is the biggest paper in the whole of Belfast, and I've managed to find an article, the first article about Thomas and John going missing, and it's on page 5. 4 days after they went missing, this is the first article on their disappearance. There's a number of things striking me about this. The article itself is so small, literally just a corner of a page, and there's no pictures of Thomas and John. Even with the political situation, even with the Troubles raging, 2 missing boys at such a young age, missing for a number of days, in my opinion, should still have been a front page story, but it wasn't.
I don't think it was a story that would have sort of featured very highly. If I'd gone to my editor and said, I'll tell you what, there's some kids that have disappeared, but we're not quite sure because nobody seems to know where they've gone, I'd have been dismissed. The story, nobody would have, the editor would have said to me, Come on, there were better things to deal with. There were adults disappearing and nobody asked. Northern Ireland was different. The front page was being dominated by other things. Kids were somewhere way down the agenda if they were there at all. In fact, to be perfectly honest, they weren't really.
I've written to the Chief Constable. I've tried to contact the police a number of times. And to be honest, they haven't been that helpful. I sent them a Freedom of Information request, asking the exact dates when these boys went missing. And in their responses, they got the dates wrong twice. I also asked for the locations in which these boys were last seen. That request was denied.
Does that not strike you as a little bit odd?
Yeah, it is, and I don't get it, because when someone goes missing, the location in which they are last seen is crucially important.
This refusal to disclose details around last sightings is particularly strange, given this piece of archive from December 1974, in which the boys' mothers were reassured that Thomas and John had been seen.
You're quite happy that they're alive and well and just hiding somewhere in Belfast?
Well, when the police gave me the information yesterday, they had been definitely seen from yesterday, yes, I did, but before I was very, very doubtful.
So at least
I wasn't sure, like, no, things happened, like...
You're a lot happier now, though, that you know that
yes.
they probably are alive. So what do you want them to do now? Come
I
back
want them to come home, yeah.
for Christmas. What would happen to them when they do come home?
I'd give them a big kiss if he come home.
How about you, then?
I would do the same. I'd throw my arms around him. I would.
It must have been a very awkward time waiting for this past month.
Mm.
So this would be the best Christmas present that you could get.
Mm.
So what would you like to say to your boy, then?
I could throw my arms around him and kiss him. I would.
I'm actually gobsmacked watching this news footage. One of these other sightings that the police are telling Anne Spence, they haven't been released to the public. This is a hugely misleading piece of footage.
To try and better understand what happened back in 1974 and to find out what's happening with the case now, we really need to speak with the Police Service of Northern Ireland. But after 9 months, they haven't responded to our request for interview. However, a retired senior detective who reviewed the case back in the early 2000s has agreed to meet with us on the basis of anonymity.
So, what are your first impressions when you open the case file?
Well, I was thinking that it was so sad that two boys had gone missing and there wasn't an awful lot that I had to go on. They had photographs of the boys concerned and descriptions of what they were wearing, etc., but there wasn't an awful lot of statements in relation to where they were last seen or from the school or for people on the bus. So I was disappointed that there wasn't a lot more to show the lives of these two boys.
I've seen footage from 1974 where Anne Spence and Alice Rogers are led to believe there are other sightings of the boys, that they would be home for Christmas. You've seen what's in those files. Were there any other sightings?
Well, I've got to say, I didn't see any of it. I wasn't aware of any sightings.
I'm just really struggling to figure out why the police would tell the family something that wasn't necessarily true.
Well, I can't answer that. I'm not aware of what the sightings were. But sightings, by virtue of what they are, can be flawed unless they're followed up and examined carefully.
Did you manage to find out anything at all about the boys' movements?
There was evidence that the boys, both of them actually, had managed to evade school in the weeks prior to this disappearance that we were investigating in 1974.
Or what's your initial reaction to what you heard there?
That was really interesting because this is a former senior detective who worked on the case many years later, and he confirms that there is very little in the case files, which makes me question how thorough was the initial investigation back in 1974. One of the key things I picked up on was the fact that Thomas and John went missing playing truant from school prior to their disappearance. Unfortunately, we know that children who play truant are much more vulnerable. So, did Thomas and John meet someone? Someone who took advantage of the situation? Someone who saw an opportunity and wished to do them great harm?
Whatever the shortcomings of the investigation at the time, nearly 3 decades later, detectives were clearly convinced that harm had likely come to the boys.
This morning we are commencing an extensive search which will include major excavations at 50 and 56 Rodney Drive in the West Belfast.
In the course of another inquiry, it emerged that a paedophile was living on the same street as John Rogers when he and Thomas disappeared. But despite extensive searches, nothing was found. The Falls Road has changed considerably since 1974, but Robert believes he can still find people who remember Thomas and John, people who could help fill in some of the missing detail around their disappearance.
Two young boys who went missing in this area. Do you remember anything about it?
I remember vividly, but I knew his parents.
This was John Rogers?
Rogers, yeah. It was actually over across the road here that he lived over in the St. James's Rodney area. Yeah, I knew his father, and his mother was Alice, who was a lovely wee lady, you know.
I actually lived beside one of the boys, John Rogers.
Okay.
Lived next door to my parents, you know. I remember the wee boy playing in the street, you know, and stuff.
I ran about with one of them, John Rogers. He was a good friend of mine. There was a couple of years difference between me and John.
I knew John. John was adopted, and I knew Thomas to see. And like chalk and cheese, although the two of them were vulnerable kids.
My mum actually met young Spence at the bottom of the street there, at the bus stop. She was going around the shop.
Yes.
And she says, tell him what's wrong with you, son? You're late for school. He says, yes, my mum, he slept in. And she was the last person to speak to him.
What kind of boy was John?
Very quiet.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very shy kid. Didn't come out of himself much. Lovely nature. But he was bullied a lot.
Thomas was a wee bit more mischievous. So it was a shock when the two of them went missing.
Two children just disappearing from a bus stop must have caused a great shock in the local area at the time.
Oh God, it was a terrible shock. I think it was a terrible shock to everybody up and down the falls.
My mother actually went about with Alice Rogers looking for him. She was told he was seen in different parts of the country, and my mother went with her looking for him.
She was always out looking for him, you know, at night and stuff, all hours of the night.
No matter what the weather was like, hail, rain, sleet or snow, she trudged the streets looking for him.
And I actually heard her going up the street calling his name. You know, it was so sad.
Can you recall any rumours were going around there at the time amongst the people as to what could have happened to Thomas and John?
Initially, at the start, people thought they had run away. I would think for a lot of weeks. He was supposed to be in London, Dublin.
So then, as rumours do tend to take off, I started to run rife. You know, was this a Protestant Catholic thing? Were there loyalists involved in this? Did they run off? It was alleged they had run off one time before.
And then sometimes they talked about the army. Could they have taken them away or, you know, and buried them in the bogs or...
The stories were abounding, you know, that they've went away with the Brits or something. You heard all sorts of rumours and stories, you know.
People were making up their own stories, if you ask me.
The Falls Road was a Catholic area of the city. The RUC was an overwhelmingly Protestant force. Its members were seen as legitimate targets by the IRA. Anyone seen talking to them would also become a target. Knowing this, I can understand why any investigation at the time could have been hampered.
You know, people nowadays, they're trying to look back at the Troubles and say, what would it have been like in sort of somewhere like West Belfast or the Falls area? Probably a bit like, I guess, the West Bank. It's not like you're sending in a team of detectives the way you would in Britain. And they'd be interviewing everybody saying, did you see, where were you at 12:10? Or they're putting out flyers, did you see this child on the road? So maybe people saw a kid at a bus stop, saw maybe a man or maybe a car coming up, and the kid getting into a car or being forced into a car. If somebody's forced into a car, you don't do anything about it if you're living in one of those areas. You don't do it. People were always sort of very wary of being reported as someone who might be an informer. So people didn't talk.
Despite what Thomas allegedly told a witness, I've discovered that the Spence family were awake as normal that morning. So did the boys deliberately plan to miss the bus? Thomas and John had slight learning difficulties, and because of this, they attended a school on the other side of Belfast, something that was uncommon in a divided city. John McMullen is an old school friend who shared that journey with them most mornings.
John.
Yeah.
Thanks for agreeing to meet me.
Good to meet you.
Thank you. 45 years.
45 years. Long, long time ago. Bad memories.
Bad memories?
Yeah. I was taught childhood too, you know. The bus was hijacked every other day. Sometimes on the bus for an hour. Most times there was a bomb or something. There's always something to fail us. They finally put on a name on the bus, special bus number 21, but stopped the IRA and the rather than hijacking it. I always stood up to the bus driver. I was a fiver on the bus on Shaw's Road.
When Thomas and John got in the bus, where did they sit? Where did you sit?
As I said, we were always in the first seat. And Tom, I'd been sitting here, and he'd sat here all the time. And John just sat at the back, and then again, he was back and forward, you know, just back and forward and eating sweets, and someone was shouting in the background, going things, you know. We were all messed about, 24/7. And the bus owner was shouting, sit down, no. We were all mad, like.
What kind of boy was Thomas?
Thomas was a nice, bubbly boy. I stuttered and he stuttered. I was far worse than him. We used to slag each other all the time, you know. He called me Tut-Tut. I called him Choppy Ditch because he had two different coloured eyes. It was all a laugh, you know. But we were friends. We're coming up now to the corner here. I would normally see them just around here, you know. Just now this piece of boogie's here, now the shop is here. This is it. And that morning, I was expecting to see him standing at the corner, but they never came in the vision.
Were you worried that they weren't there?
No, I wasn't really that worried because I knew all that week they said they had to go to the circus. So I knew in my head, but I didn't tell anybody what happened. We went to the circus with the school. It was a day trip. Can't remember all the acts. I know it was a very small circus too. It wasn't a big giant circus. I remember there was only one elephant and a couple of horses and all. But after the circus was over, I don't know what teacher was talking to say thanks and all, but we were still running about. And I remember us three getting around the back of a tent. Just big muscle man, big baldy head man, big tattoos. No one like one of them you were seeing in the circus, the big bodybuilder. And John says, "Here, mister, how do you want to leave a circus?" And that's all I remember him saying. And then he says, "We're leaving next week. Come down and meet us." From that day, that's when I started saving money. I said, "Look, Thomas, don't be going with it." I knew John wanted to go. He was never really happy the way Thomas was, me and Thomas was. I said, "Look, I'm not going to the circus."
I can see why, for a child at that time in Belfast, how the circus could be very attractive. You run away with the circus, a means of escape. John also talked about how John Rogers wasn't completely happy. And for a child who's feeling like that, the circus becomes much more attractive. It becomes something that, as he said himself, John was taking seriously.
Kids run away with the circus. When I hear that, I think of something you'd see in a Hollywood movie, or it doesn't quite ring true to me. What do you think?
I'm not so sure that it is possible, but as a line of inquiry, I can't completely rule it out either. John is a really credible eyewitness, and he is adamant that they had planned this. They had talked about it, they had saved up quite a bit of money. There could be something on it.
Given what we've been told so far, the lack of detail in the official files, the fact the boys had played truant previously, and the confusing archive with their mothers, it feels to me that this was being treated as a pair of runaways rather than anything more sinister. But with hindsight and more data, we now know that two young boys disappearing together without trace is an incredibly rare thing to happen. I've only been able to find a handful of similar cases throughout the world. But incredibly, Thomas and John weren't the first pair of friends to go missing off the streets of Belfast, never to be seen again.
The week before his 12th birthday, David Leckey from Gemmell Street goes missing on his way to school. It was the 25th of September, 1969. Just over a mile away, 14-year-old Jonathan Aven also mysteriously disappears. It is believed they went missing together.
Robert, this is another pair of young boys just disappeared. What's your gut reaction?
It's very strange because Belfast is a very small city. And here we have two sets of missing boys within a 4-mile radius of each other, two in 1974 and two more 5 years earlier in 1969. We seriously should be considering the possibility that these cases could be linked.
The Avens were a British military family who moved to East Belfast in 1966. Lisa is Jonathan's younger sister.
When Jonathan disappeared as such, I was a kid. I wasn't worried about him. In actual fact, I suppose, really, I could think that it might have been a bit of an adventure, you know, a boy's adventure, really, because I didn't realise the seriousness of it. We were a military family, and we'd heard that father was going to get posted again. So it meant the only time that we'd, as older children, had roots and had friends was then. Jonathan was happy there, and I just think he'd decided there and then he wasn't going to move. So he left. My parents were very much, you know, not open for discussion. I think stiff upper lip, like British and military. So I think their coping mechanism was not to discuss it.
Have you been able to talk about it over the years, or is it still something that kind of feels a bit off limits? You know what I mean about that? It feels a bit
Yeah. His disappearance and everything that went through it. Yeah, it's easier not to talk about it, most certainly. Yeah, when you say off limits, yeah, that's a good word actually, because once it's out in the open, it's still raw. So. Yeah, I'm not saying you forget, but it's certainly a lot easier if you don't talk about it. You know, it's not until you become older and a parent now and you realise then how gut-wrenching it must have been day in, day out for them.
Jonathan Aven was a runaway. He's away from home for almost a week when he meets up with David Leckey and they decide to mitch off school. That is the last day they are seen together.
From what we've been able to piece together of the boys' last movements, it would seem that on the day of the disappearance, they met up with 2 other boys, and all 4 spent the day playing truant from school. Something that we know Thomas and John also did in 1974. At some point in the evening, the 4 got separated. 2 made it home. David and Jonathan never did. Long before Robert or I started to look at these cases, Darren Brown was trying to find out what he could about David Leckey's disappearance.
Robert, these are a handful of photographs that I sort of pulled out. This is Annie and her boys. So you have William, and you've got John, and you've got David. You know, and if you look at this image, they're happy, they're smiling, but you look at Annie, she's got the 2 boys, and she's got a grasp of them. She's holding them tight. You know, she's not letting them go. Like there's no he's taking them boys away from her. That's for sure. And to be honest, it's probably one of the last photographs of David. I moved to Belfast in 1986, and I started lodging with the Leckeys. I lived there for 4 or 5 years. Nothing seemed out of place. It was just a normal working class Belfast family. You know, I'd been living there 4 or 5 days a week, and you know, I got really, really close to Annie, and never once had David's name been mentioned. This was a complete shock to me. Obviously, the reason for that is that's how she learned to cope with the fact that she had lost her wee boy. It was a huge surprise.
According to Darren, Annie never spoke about David, taking the pain of not knowing what happened to her son to the grave. It was only years later that he was able to piece together the story for himself.
When David went missing, at that time, Annie held down 5 jobs a day. She finished around 8 o'clock in the evening. Then she come home and she went out searching for her son. You know, she went out night after night after night for weeks, for months, literally years, looking up and down every street. You know, she combed the whole of the shipyard and the Belfast docks, every inch of it, looking for David, shouting out his name, hoping he would answer back. He never did. This wee woman should never have been left on her own. Her child mattered, her family mattered, and people should have been there to help her. She shouldn't have been left to walk these streets. It wouldn't have fucking happened anywhere else in the UK. But for some reason, it's Belfast. So what?
A desperate mother out searching for her son is something we've heard before. 5 years later, Alice Rogers will be doing exactly the same thing on the opposite side of the city. Why were these women just left to try and find their own answers? Answers that Darren is still searching for.
The family didn't know very much, so I contacted the police and asked, on behalf of the family, could we see David's file? They came back to say that they couldn't find it, that the file was either lost or destroyed. And this took me back a bit. I was shocked, stunned. You know, this file has just mysteriously disappeared.
Was there anything you were able to find out about that original police investigation?
Annie reported David missing that evening, and the police came and took a statement from her. And then they came back a week later, not to give her any news, but to see whether David had come home. And they haven't been back since. 50 years on, and they still haven't been near the family to give them any information, to let them know how the investigation was going, where they're at the minute. Is the case still even running? Or is it just a file in a cabinet somewhere, locked away? And until somebody pokes the hive with a stick, nothing will be done.
From what we know about these cases, do you think there could be a link?
Well, I certainly believe there are strong similarities between these cases. I mean, we're dealing with 4 young boys aged between 11 and 14. That's a very specific age group, early teens. When a child goes missing, the younger the child, the higher the chance of abduction with a sexual motive. We know at least 3 of these boys went to school or classes associated with children who had a slight educational need. So that adds to their vulnerability. Another vulnerability factor is the fact that these boys played truant from school just prior to them going missing. So they weren't where they were supposed to be. That gives an offender an opportunity. In criminology, we often say there's no such thing as a coincidence. Due to the specific age group and due to the similarities in the circumstances of their disappearances, I firmly believe we are looking at cases of child abduction and murder with a sexual motive.
Although there was endless extreme violence throughout the Troubles, crime outside of the sectarian conflict was minimal. Child abduction and murder was almost unheard of. But it did happen. In 1973, another young boy went missing, but unlike the cases in 69 and 74, it did make headline news.
Okay, come on, work round. A body has been recovered today from the River Lagan in South Belfast.
Up to the very top first, and then we'll walk down this way.
The discovery was made as the police continue the search for missing schoolboy Brian McDermott.
The partial remains of 10-year-old Brian McDermott were found in September 1973. His killer has never been caught.
Brian McDermott was missing 6 days before he was found. His remains were found in a Hessian sack in the River Lagan. He had been dismembered. Two of Brian's legs and an arm were missing from the Hessian sack. The remains that were found in the Hessian sack were charred. He'd been burnt. This was one of the most brutal, gruesome murders in the history of Northern Ireland. The reason why I am so interested in this case is because the names of our missing boys, David and Jonathan, start to appear in articles relating to Brian's murder. For example, here's an article in a newsletter 4 days after Brian's remains are found, and it talks about the file of the missing boys being reopened as part of the investigation into Brian's murder. I have found a number of articles that mention Brian McDermott with David and Jonathan. It really doesn't surprise me at all that the police are looking at possible connections between these cases, and it makes sense because these are 3 young boys of a similar age who went missing from near their homes in the same area, in this case, East Belfast.
There's been a lot of speculation about this death, especially as it was such a vile crime, and there has been talk of witchcraft. Do you know anything of this?
Yes, I've heard these speculations, but I think it's too early in the day for people to come down that it was as a result of witchcraft.
Given the incredibly brutal nature of this crime, I'm not surprised that strange and unsettling rumours began to take hold amongst a shocked public. As the years passed, without the murder being solved, other rumours began to circulate. Brian's brother William, who was 16 at the time, confessed to the murder, but later stated that this confession was coerced. I've spoken to William, and he maintains that he had nothing to do with his brother's murder. And the police's own subsequent report would back this up.
Senior RUC officers were not convinced of McDermott's guilt. They felt his account lacked details which would have been expected from the person responsible for the murder. Forensic scientists were unable to find anything to support William McDermott's statement, and a consultant psychiatrist was not convinced that his confession was genuine.
The person who would commit an act like this would have to be an extremely callous, brutal, cold individual who had no feeling for his victim. What would stop the ordinary person committing an act like this would be that he would feel sorry and have pity for his victim. But an individual like this would have no feeling and in fact might almost get some pleasure or perverted excitement or thrill out of this type of murder.
Brian McDermott's murder remains unsolved, just like the disappearances of Thomas and John and David and Jonathan. Is there a connection? If so, then what can it tell us about who might be behind these crimes? I've sent our files to Professor David Canter, a forensic psychologist who has worked extensively with police forces across the world investigating serial murder.
When I first looked through the files of this, it did seem very strange that you'd have these 4 boys disappearing and a body found, and all in the same area over broadly the same period of time. I can't think of any other cases where boys, 10, 12, 14-year-old boys, disappeared around the same time, in the same area, and then in pairs. That I've never come across anything quite like that before. Finding the body of Brian McDermott mutilated and attempt to set fire to it is very important to try and understand as part of this process.
Okay, and we go around the bank, follow the river round.
This killing has a sophistication to it that I don't think you could really associate with a 16-year-old. For a start, the indications are that the attempt was to make sure that the body would never be found. In other words, that the boy would have disappeared without any notice. But also, if the body was found, any of the forensic evidence would not be available. I mean, the first question has got to be, are these linked in some way? Is there a common offender, or is there a network, or was there something about what was going on in this area at the time that brings all these crimes together? That's surely got to be the starting point in thinking about such an unusual cluster of disappearances.
Could it be that the conflict unfolding in Northern Ireland at the time provided the perfect cover for someone to carry out and get away with horrific crimes against children?
Serial predators will look for opportunity. They'll seek out where there are likely to be vulnerable victims. And the context of the circumstances in Northern Ireland around the time of the disappearance of these 4 boys, I think, could create that sort of opportunity.
Once society begins fracturing, once it begins fragmenting, the established social order is shredded. And you have a situation where it's totally absurd when you look back now, but within the National Health System in Belfast, they had a centre which dealt with aggressive psychopaths. In other words, people who posed a threat to society, to you and me and anyone else. They ran out of patients. Now, why does a place like that run out of patients? Because the patients are on the streets. The actual patients are on the streets, and they're either slitting people's throats or they're involved in other fairly grisly crimes. They would have been shunned in the past because people knew that guy's into some bad stuff. The normal rules of behavior are suspended. So whether he's a pedophile, whether he's an aggressive psychopath, he is in there and he is finding acceptance among his peers. They're suddenly heroes in their own communities. This is what the Troubles opened up. So once society falls apart like that, people are not making the same judgments. They're not capable of making the same judgments.
It's been a year since I first approached the police with questions about historical cases of missing boys in Belfast. I have since spoken on the record with an assistant chief constable. They have told me that all the cases were thoroughly investigated at the time. All have been reviewed since, and all remain open. They have found no evidential links to connect them. But I do have to question whether they've done everything they can. When Darren Brown initially approached them looking for information, he was told David Leckey's case file was either lost or destroyed. Undeterred, he took it upon himself to search for answers, and he uncovered some potentially sinister connections.
Started scrolling through the internet and, looking through old news clippings, back in the day. I went through years and years of microfilm searching for news articles on David's disappearance. And I finally came across the article of David's disappearance and the school that he went to, Oakley High School on the Ravenhill Road. And I then made a connection between it and Kincora Boys Home in East Belfast, because a lot of the kids that went to that home also attended Oakley High School.
Kincora is a name I'm familiar with. It was a boys' home in Loyalist East Belfast, where organised child sex abuse took place. When the story broke in 1980, it caused a major scandal. Is it possible that David and Jonathan's disappearance could be connected to this location in some way?
During my search, I came across a news article, and the boys were actually mentioned in it.
As the RUC investigation into Kincora continues, the Kincora team of detectives is studying the files on 2 East Belfast boys who disappeared in 1969. 14-year-old Jonathan Aven from Sydenham Drive disappeared in September of that year, as did 12-year-old David Leckey, who lived at Gemmell Street.
I went back to the police and I said, could you go back and have a look in the Kincora case files? And there it was. They found it. That was down to me. I had to go and tell the police where to find their file. Honestly.
Darren has never been granted access to the file, and without that access, it's difficult to know exactly what led police to connect Kincora to the boys' disappearance. But it's clear that they did, and I need to try and find out why.
This is a place where the serious sexual abuse of children was happening. Looking at its location, it's only a mile away from where David Leckey lived, and only half a mile away from where Jonathan Aven lived.
David and Jonathan went missing in 1969. Kincora wasn't exposed until 1980, but it seems that paedophiles had been active there for decades. The British Army were deployed in Northern Ireland at the start of the civil unrest. Intelligence gathering was part of their remit. Colin Wallace, a senior information officer, claims he first became aware of what was happening at Kincora in the early 1970s.
We were picking this up from sources on the ground, and if we were able to pick this up, it is totally unbelievable that the vast intelligence network, including the police, weren't picking up those same rumours. It was common currency at that time.
Colin claims that his attempts to expose or investigate what was happening at Kincora were blocked by his superiors. It wasn't until the Irish Independent newspaper published an article years later that the whole affair was brought to light.
Why did it take a newspaper to publish something to force the police to take action they could have taken back in 73 and 74 when I raised it with the press at the very beginning?
Chris Moore was an investigative reporter with the BBC at the time, and he covered this story extensively.
Kincora was investigated in 1980 after the first allegations were made. As a result, in December 1981, 6 men were convicted in court. 3 of them, importantly, were the staff from Kincora. There was Joe Mains, who was the warder, his deputy, Raymond Semple. But the most interesting figure in the Kincora saga was William McGrath.
William McGrath was clearly the leader of the organisation. He was well known in the Orange Order. He'd been involved in unionist politics. He was at the forefront of a lot of unionist loyalist thinking at that time.
When the police started their investigation here at Kincora House last year, they began by trying to trace 184 former inmates. And that's when the offences at 2 other homes came to light.
In December 1981, 3 staff from Kincora were convicted, but 3 others from 2 other homes were also convicted. There was Peter Bone, Robert Elder, and Eric Whitchell. Whitchell was known to make telephone calls to Mains and vice versa, and I think they exchanged information about boys. That suggests to me, at a very early stage, there was evidence of a network of paedophiles.
But let's put it this way, there were a lot of players out there in the midst of all that chaos. And it was known what they were doing, and it was ignored. It was ignored both within loyalism itself and it was ignored by the authorities.
I suppose a lot of people thought that was the end of the matter, that the police had done a good job, that the state had done a good job. But the truth is, at least 10 years before this, the authorities were told about the abuse. The police were able to do nothing. And any attempt to get the police involved was resisted, particularly by MI5.
MI5, the British Counterintelligence and Security Service, were also on the ground in Northern Ireland. Separate from Army intelligence, though connected at a senior level, they operated covertly on both sides of the conflict. I'm intrigued by Chris Moore's claim that they blocked attempts to investigate a network of paedophiles. If true, why would they do this? Rumours of conspiracy and cover-up have persisted for decades.
It was a scandal which the prosecution at last December's hearing described as Northern Ireland's Watergate. The most serious aspect of this particular story is that at least 2 British civil servants working at the Northern Ireland office at Stormont were allegedly involved, as well as policemen, businessmen and justices of the peace.
Was there a cover-up by the authorities? If so, why? And just how far did it go? These aren't new questions. They were being asked back in the 1980s at the highest level.
There are feelings in this House. There are wider and deeper issues here which need to be identified by a wider and deeper inquiry. This will not go away. There is no hiding place.
The real issue at stake in this matter are those people who may have lost their lives as a result of the activities of a dirty trick department, those young lives which were blighted because of organised buggery, which may have been part of that same campaign.
Brian Gemmell was a young Army intelligence official on the ground in Belfast in the mid-1970s.
The ends justify the means. That's all the way through the intelligence community. The ends justify the means.
Brian claims that in 1975, he made his superiors aware of the abuse taking place at Kincora. He's now prepared to reveal why he thinks his concerns were completely ignored.
McGrath told one of my sources personally that he was recruited years ago by MI6, particularly because of his travels to Eastern Europe with Bibles and other things.
So the intelligence services more than likely would have been aware of William McGrath, what was going on.
I am absolutely certain about that.
For decades now, there have been reports done into Kincora. There have been conspiracy theories about systematic abuse of boys.
Well, I believe they're not conspiracies. These are facts that have been whitewashed and put under the carpet and then underneath all the furniture and then sat upon.
Were the intelligence services somehow involved with Kincora? Could this be the reason why reports of abuse were allegedly ignored? It's an incredibly murky history, and I need to find out how this might be connected to our missing and murdered boys. Colin Wallace is probably the person best placed to help me. Ostensibly a press officer, he was actually part of a covert unit operating at a top secret level in Northern Ireland. So secret that the British government denied all knowledge of its existence. It wasn't until 1990 that Margaret Thatcher finally admitted Colin's and the unit's role in a statement to Parliament. tell me, what was your involvement in the army? What was your role?
From 1969 until 1975, I was the Senior Information Officer for Psychological Warfare in Northern Ireland. The basic role of psychological operations was to disrupt terrorism. So to do that, I had to study terrorist organisation, their members, and particularly I was looking for what we call black intelligence. It was to try and identify weak spots where we could put pressure on individuals and groups to manipulate what they were doing.
Multiple terrorist groups were active on both sides in the Northern Irish conflict. Loyalists vowing to protect their British identity at all costs, and Republicans fighting to remove the British presence in Ireland. Their tit-for-tat sectarian bombing and murder campaigns were pushing the country to the brink of civil war. In the middle of all this carnage was William McGrath. The man who was involved in running a children's home was also the leader of an extreme loyalist organisation.
He was a founder of a group called Tara, a small paramilitary group, a ginger group, and they had access to some weapons. They also brought some weapons in from Holland at one occasion. So McGrath was of interest to anyone who wanted to understand the Kincora.
Initially, it was very difficult for us to get close to Kincora because theoretically this was a police matter. The only reason that we could look at it was McGrath was leading a paramilitary organisation, and that gave us the justification. But as 1973 progressed, we got more and more information coming out that abuse was taking place. And we also were aware that the RUC knew of those allegations. Now, this was very important. The problem that my superiors had, they were very conscious that the RUC were participating in Tara meetings. And we also believed that there were close links between prominent Tara officers and senior officers in the RUC.
For reasons that weren't entirely clear, Colin was removed from duty in Northern Ireland. A tribunal would later rule that he was unfairly dismissed from the army.
All the files in the PSYOPs unit that I had compiled during, I suppose, the previous 5 years were all destroyed. And that's now a matter of record admitted by the MOD. The question arises, who authorised the destruction of those files? And part of the problem, therefore, that when you try to investigate something like Kincora, the authorities will say, we can find no evidence of that. And of course, what they're saying is true. But they know they can't find it because they've destroyed it. And therefore, what can you do with that?
White Volvo sports car hijacked on the Aldergrove to Belfast Road. A last seen heading towards Belfast.
In the decades since the Troubles have ended, the state's involvement in the conflict, how its operatives gathered intelligence, and how that intelligence was used has become much clearer.
And one of them is armed. Over.
One of the things that people are very naive about is the whole sort of dirty war, the war in the shadows, the undercover war, where you have all these different sort of competing elements. You've got British intelligence, you've got the terrorists themselves, and then you've got the agents. You've got the agents who are being run within these terrorist organizations, who are betraying the organizations. Some of these agents are going to be criminals, they're going to be killers, they're going to be some of them very experienced terrorists, and some are going to be pedophiles. And what they did, British intelligence, they used compromising information on people to recruit them. In other words, blackmail them. So they might blackmail somebody about being a pedophile. It's very often money too is involved. This is deep down and dirty, this whole business. It's a transaction. And the transaction with pedophiles is, let them be pedophiles. As long as they're doing what we need them to do in the war effort.
If true, this all points to a much darker underbelly of state complicity in the conflict. Known paedophiles and murderers allegedly operating with impunity, so long as they provided information on their terrorist associates.
This is highly damaging to the whole world of security, both from the army and intelligence. Northern Ireland was a dreadful situation. Intelligence was a huge weapon in getting the peace that we've got today, but at what price?
They have to decide whether or not they would allow that activity to continue to protect their source, even if it meant little boys going on being brutally raped and sodomized and abused, or even in some occasions, to allow people to die.
So it's always about this sort of moral dilemma, but the moral dilemma is always in favor of winning the war. It's never in saving kids. This kind of thing happened, and people just don't understand that it happened, but it did.
It's difficult to fathom, but if known paedophiles were paid agents of the state, allowed to abuse children, then is it possible that a blind eye was turned when David and Jonathan went missing in 1969, when Brian McDermott was murdered in 1973, and when Thomas and John disappeared in 1974? Could this be why their cases haven't been solved and the perpetrators never brought to justice?
The level that this was at was just not a matter of a few people who worked in children's homes at the bottom end of the scale. This went right to the top. It had to.
The Kincora case and the alleged involvement of MI5 was considered as part of a wider inquiry into historical abuse cases in Northern Ireland. Chaired by retired Judge Sir Anthony Hart, the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry published its findings in 2017. It found no evidence that MI5 had any involvement in Kincora or to the paedophile network connected to it, and no evidence of a cover-up, as many whistleblowers and journalists continue to claim. But much like similar inquiries which were established in the 1980s, there are growing concerns that its powers weren't far-reaching enough to get to the truth.
Sir Anthony Hart's inquiry into abuse in children's homes in Northern Ireland was a very important step in providing truth to victims across a whole range of children's homes. But with respect to Kincora, the core accusation was not looking at the local welfare board or who worked in a particular home. It was an accusation around state complicity at a national UK level. The HIA inquiry in Northern Ireland only had powers of compulsion to individuals and agencies, including arms of government, within Northern Ireland.
The HIA could only accept voluntary information from MI5. There was no cross-examination, really, of the facts. There was no interrogation. There was no investigation into MI5. So what way did MI5 contribute to the HIA? Well, they volunteered information.
Public inquiry, crucially to be human rights compliant, has to have powers of compulsion and not rely on voluntary cooperation. And so it was clear that if an inquiry was going to get to the bottom of what had really gone on and the truth or otherwise of these allegations, it needed to be able to reach into the bowels of Whitehall, open up those filing cabinets and get the crucial files, the crucial documentation and the crucial witnesses. And I think it would require somebody to be of enormous goodwill towards the security services to say that they would never lie or they would never withhold evidence from an inquiry that may find them in a very bad light.
MI5 assured officials that they had shared all files they held, but a recent Freedom of Information request has revealed that even after the inquiry had been established, relevant documents were being destroyed.
I think there's very serious questions to be asked about the timing of this. These are documents that obviously someone didn't want the HIA to see.
But some of the documents that MI5 did want the HIA to see are now available as public record to be scrutinised.
A load of tripe. They were releasing false information, releasing wrong, untruthful information.
Mike Taylor, another former Army intelligence officer, is one of a number of primary witnesses I have now spoken to, who claim their testimony has either been directly contradicted or completely disregarded by the inquiry.
They sent a letter about me saying that this is the information we're going to use, and stamped with MI5 confidential.
This statement was accepted as evidence. Its content helps to discredit the claims of whistleblowers like Colin Wallace and Brian Gemmell.
A police officer had supposedly visited my home and got this statement from me. Not only did he not come to my house or my home at any time, but this official statement of witness was not signed by this detective inspector, and it was certainly not signed by the signature of witness where my name was put.
So it's fair to say that you believe this statement was fabricated?
Yes. Oh yeah, totally.
It's a matter of public record that MI5 had historically considered falsifying documents to throw investigations into Kincora off track. Could they have actually done so at the HIA inquiry? If this is the case, what could possibly be so uncomfortable that they couldn't risk the truth getting out? And could it involve our missing and murdered boys? Despite numerous requests, no one from MI5 is willing to speak with me, and the HIA inquiry is now closed. I have been unable to engage with anyone connected to it. To try and get some definitive answers, we need to re-examine thousands of historical documents that have been released into the public domain. They include filed police reports, official government memos, and intelligence briefings. Studied together, they start to shine a light on what was happening at the time.
What is really striking is just how many paedophiles were active in Belfast during the 1960s and 70s.
It seems the men who were convicted of child sex offences at Kincora were connected to a wider group of men who have also been implicated in the organised sexual abuse of young boys.
Men like Ken Larmour, a court official, Dr. Maurice Fraser, a senior child psychiatrist, John McCaig, a high-ranking loyalist paramilitary, and Alan Campbell, a student who went on to become a teacher of religious studies and a pastor. Alan Campbell and John McCaig were known associates, and according to this document, were regular visitors to William McGrath's house.
McCaig and Campbell were never convicted of child sex abuse. However, both men were subject to accusations. Their links to this paedophile network and their alleged crimes are well documented. The claims against Alan Campbell, the youngest of this group, are particularly striking in light of our investigation.
This is only part of a submission from former Detective Chief Superintendent George Caskey. Paragraph 34 states that a schoolboy alleged that he had been picked up by Campbell on a bus in Wellington Place, Belfast, and that he had been taken to a flat where he was indecently assaulted by Campbell. Campbell was alleged to have said to him, "I'll stick a knife in you if you tell anybody."
And what's outstanding about this case involving Alan Campbell is that he was able to get away with this crime. He managed to escape a court case. He got a friend who was a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, a female friend, to give him an alibi. She said that he was with her that night and her husband. It was only later when they realised why he needed the alibi that they went to the police and withdrew it.
Despite the evidence and the withdrawal of Campbell's alibi, the case collapsed and the police investigation mysteriously ended. The entire case file was later destroyed in an apparent bombing.
I mean, I have talked about our boys going missing and the likelihood of child abduction. This is a child abduction. The bus is interesting because we know on the morning that Thomas and John go missing, they are last seen at a public bus stop. The report suggests that not only was he prepared to commit this horrific indecent assault on an innocent child, but he was prepared to use violence to get away with it. And that makes me think of the murder of Brian McDermott.
The police would have been aware of the claims against Alan Campbell when Brian McDermott was found murdered. They would also have been aware of individuals in the wider paedophile ring to which he was linked. But yet, to the best of our knowledge, none of these men were ever questioned or named as persons of interest. This is all the more incredible, given the contents of a recently released government memo, which reveals some explosive information. At a high-level meeting in 1982, the Secretary of State and the Lord Chancellor were briefed by the Attorney General. He outlined that the RUC were investigating different aspects of the Kincora affair, including how a man may have withheld information on the murder of Brian McDermott. The meeting was told that this information conflicted with what the RUC had previously told ministers and officials. It was noted that this left the government in an embarrassing and exposed position. It didn't become a problem though, because despite these revelations, this information was kept top secret. Only now, decades later, can it be revealed that the man they were referring to was Alan Campbell. In 1973, how did you come to be involved in the investigation into the murder of Brian McDermott?
I became particularly interested in the murder of Brian McDermott because of the allegation that witchcraft was involved. The army had been running a witchcraft-type project for very good reasons. We were trying to force parents to keep their children indoors, out of the clutches of paramilitaries. And to some extent it was triggered off by some information we had that there was genuinely people dabbling, and mostly paedophiles, significantly, dabbling in the occult.
In 1973, a young boy revealed to police that he had attended what he described as strange meetings with McCaig, Campbell and other men, where sexual advances were made. He thought this might have something to do with Brian McDermott's murder. What were these strange meetings? And could this cryptic detail help explain some of the wild rumours circulating at the time?
and there has been talk of witchcraft. Do you know anything of this?
I think it's too early in the day for people to come down that it was as a result of witchcraft.
When we actually then began to look at the murder in more detail, the information we got back from police sources was that a friend of John McCaig's, i.e. Alan Campbell, was one of the main suspects. And it was at that stage we then discovered that 2 boys had disappeared in 1969 within walking distance. So when you put the addresses together, if you look at the map and you look at where Kincora sat on the Newton Ards Road, you could draw a circle and think, well, this is so obvious, there's got to be a connection.
I know there's only so much you could say, but from your point of view, was Campbell someone you thought deserved closer scrutiny in terms of the McDermott murder, and indeed the boys missing in 1969?
To me, Campbell's profile all the way through, I think, was somebody who merited very close examination. And I just feel aggrieved that we didn't make more of it. Then the fact that the case was basically closed left us to some extent frustrated because we felt there was more to it. So much of it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense.
Colin claims he communicated his concerns to his superiors in a 1974 memo.
I find it very difficult to accept that the RUC consistently failed to take action on such serious allegations unless they had specifically received some form of policy direction. Such direction could only have come from a very high political or police level. Those responsible for the murder of Brian McDermott must be brought to trial before another child is killed. And if it can be proved that there is a connection with this homosexual group, then the RUC must be forced to take action, irrespective of who is involved.
Official government inquiries have questioned the authenticity of this memo, but I've studied the evidence, which includes analysis from 3 independent experts, and I believe on the balance of probability that it is genuine. The memo was allegedly sent on the 8th of November 1974. Just 2 weeks later, Thomas Spence and John Rogers would disappear. Could Alan Campbell have been responsible for any of these crimes? And if he was, how could he possibly have gotten away without ever being questioned?
These files are not properly in place, but this section should be.
Chris Moore has kept a lot of material from his decades of investigative reporting. He wants to show me a document circulated amongst loyalists that explicitly references the double life led by McCaig and Campbell.
The document we're looking for in here is an intriguing document produced by loyalists. This is it. It says here, Campbell has been involved in loyalist politics since the 1960s. He was a founder member of the Shankill Defence Association, along with John McCaig, a known paedophile, and an associate of William McGrath, the housemaster in Kincora, a convicted paedophile. It goes on, Campbell, McGrath and McCaig were all perverts who acted as agents for British intelligence in the late 60s and 70s. And here's the most interesting line, the most telling line of all. They say, he, Campbell, is simply a devious and depraved agent of British intelligence.
This explosive claim isn't without foundation. I've since spoken to an intelligence source who confirms that he was John McCaig's handler for a brief period of time. Campbell only died in 2017. McCaig was shot dead in 1982, only days before detectives were due to interview him about his knowledge of sexual abuse, including the murder of Brian McDermott. In a divided city like Belfast, I don't believe loyalists with a profile like Alan Campbell or John McCaig would find themselves on the Republican Falls Road, where Thomas Spence and John Rogers were last sighted in 1974. But there's something that John McMullen told us about the boys' plans that day that could yet prove to be key information.
It's been a few months since I last spoke with John McMullen, a school friend of Thomas Spence and John Rogers. He told me that the boys planned to run away with what he described as a circus, based somewhere here on the Shore Road of North Belfast. So the day the boys went missing, you believe they came here?
That's all I had in my head. We talked about the circus all week. How they made it here, I do not know. Somehow they came here, or else they were picked up somewhere, I don't know. I can't say that. I can only say the circus was on this road. We came from school, Summit Road, half a mile away. This was definitely the spot.
Just like the boys' school, this circus was on the other side of the city from where they lived, close to the Loyalist Shore Road, somewhere they would have been familiar with.
I believe Thomas and John deliberately missed the bus to school that morning. Because if they're at that bus stop and the driver pulls up, they have to go to school. But we know they had other plans. I don't believe we are dealing with two runaways. Even if they had made it to the circus, they would have been turned away, disappointed. But somewhere on that journey, they've come into contact with someone ultimately responsible for their disappearance.
Robert's theory is speculative, but it does sound credible, and we've discovered more information about the Shore Road in North Belfast that could make it a place of interest in this case.
This is Ross House, a block of flats, less than a mile away from where John said the circus was. 10-minute walk. I believe this location is significant.
Multiple sources have confirmed that an apartment in Ross House is the location where Alan Campbell was alleged to have sexually assaulted and threatened to kill a young boy he'd abducted off a bus in Belfast city centre. The apartment was owned by Ken Larmour, a court official and also a paedophile who had given Campbell his own key. The apartment was a place where men met and abused young boys over a number of years.
So, given what we know now, you must think it's possible that they made it here that morning?
Well, it's only a theory, but these were streetwise kids. They were mobile. They were able to make their way around different parts of the city. But also remember, there was little to no publicity at the start of this case. Just a small article a number of days later in the newspaper with no photographs. The boys very easily could have been seen walking along this very road, and whoever saw them would not have realized the significance of what they seen. So it is entirely possible the boys made it here, and if they did, they could have run into someone like Alan Campbell.
It cannot be proved that Alan Campbell was responsible for any of these crimes. The truth is, in a city in crisis, there could be any number of similar suspects. But we now have compelling evidence which suggests that violent paedophiles were protected agents of the state. These men operated with seeming impunity in Belfast at the same time as 5 young boys were disappeared and murdered. I struggle to believe in such coincidences, If the state, or indeed anyone, knows what happened to these boys, it's time their families discovered the truth.